For 5 decades, the world watched Dr. Phil McGraw hand out advice on love
and what makes a marriage last. Yet there is a wife. The cameras never showed you a marriage she buried so deep that even his most loyal fans almost missed it. After decades of silence, she finally spoke up about the struggles she endured during her marriage to Phil. Her account does not just contradict his story. It suggests the image of a man who might be living a double life the world knows nothing about. The first marriage to Debbie Higgins McCall. Every story has a start. For Phil McGraw, the tale of his marriages begins in the suburbs of Kansas City, long before the television cameras and the millions of viewers who would come to know him as the straight-talking psychologist on daytime television. Phil had a teenage romance that followed a script written well before either of them stepped onto the stage. Philip Calvin McGraw met Debbie Higgins in the late 1960s at Shawnee Mission North High School in Overland Park, Kansas. They were young, popular, and by the standards of their community, they made total sense together. Debbie was the kind of girl who stood out in a crowd, an elegant cheerleader, with the kind of poise that made her a natural center of attention. Phil, on the other hand, was impossible to miss for another reason. He was a varsity football player with a heavy build and a presence that suggested he was headed for big things. In the social ecosystem of high school, the pairing of a cheerleader and a football player was not just common. It was expected. Phil later reflected on this dynamic in a 2002 interview with Newsweek. He explained that because of who they were in high school, the star athlete and the cheerleader, everyone around them simply assumed marriage was the next step. It was not so much a decision as it was an inevitability that their social circle treated as a foregone conclusion. When you are at the top of the high school hierarchy, he suggested the expectations of those around you can become a powerful force. And for two teenagers in Overland Park, those expectations pointed in only one direction. The two began dating seriously in their teens, and by the time they were both 20 years old, the relationship had moved past the casual stage. They had grown up together in many ways, navigating the transition from adolescence to adulthood as a unit. But marriage, as they would soon discover, is a different kind of commitment than dating, and the ease with which they moved through high school did not always translate into comfort in their married life. The formal engagement, by most accounts, was relatively brief. They had been together for years, and the wedding seemed like the logical end to everything they had built. In 1970, they stood before family and friends at the Roland Park Southbridge Presbyterian Church in Kansas and exchanged vows. It was a traditional ceremony, the kind of large church wedding that brought together extended family high school classmates and local peers. The church was packed with people who had watched them grow up, people who had cheered for Phil on the football field and admired Debbie on the sidelines. To everyone in attendance, it must have looked like the beginning of a storybook life. But what happens inside a marriage is often invisible to the people who attend the wedding. Behind closed doors, the reality of their partnership began to emerge, and it did not resemble the tale that their friends and family had imagined. According to public statements made by her brother, Bill Higgins, and confirmed by Debbie in later interviews, Phil entered the marriage with very specific expectations about what a wife should be. He wanted a traditional 1950s-style housewife, a woman who would stay home, manage the housework, and attend to his needs. The word submissive appears often in descriptions of what he demanded. This was not a partnership in the modern sense. It was a relationship defined by roles, and Debbie's role was clearly laid out for her. The demands went beyond household duties. Debbie later revealed that Phil was deeply concerned about her physical appearance and set rigid, aesthetic standards that she was expected to maintain. He was insecure about certain aspects of her body, and his response to that insecurity was to push her toward changes that would ease his anxieties. He insisted that she lift weights to alter her physique and explicitly pressured her to increase her upper body size. These were not gentle suggestions offered out of care for her health. These demands sprang from his own insecurities and burdened a young woman who was barely a wife. Despite their intense early romance and the years spent together beforehand, the marriage remained childless. Many wrongly believe they had a daughter, a mix-up, stemming from Debbie having a child with her next husband. That child, Macy McCall, was not Phil's, and was born years after this marriage had officially dissolved. During their 3 years as husband and wife, the couple never had children. That detail later became a central point of speculation when things eventually fell apart. One striking aspect of their union, historically speaking, is how completely private it remained. This was not a romance played out for cameras or splashed across tabloid magazines. Phil was not yet Dr. Phil. He was just Phil McGraw, a young man trying to find his way. He was living far from the television studios and national spotlight that would eventually make him a household name. Their relationship existed only within the private bubble of Overland Park and their local community. But the truth behind their bond was far more complicated and deeply troubling. Their split happened for reasons that went way beyond standard incompatibility. And when Debbie finally spoke out, she painted a picture of Dr. Phil McGraw that millions of fans had never seen. Consider the contentious divorce and the aftermath. It began as a high school sweetheart story, with a traditional church wedding, but it soon soured into something much darker. According to her later accounts, their home life eroded rapidly once they were wed. Phil started what she described as freezing her out, an emotional withdrawal that left her completely isolated. When he came home from school or work, he would routinely refuse to speak to her at all. This silence was not the easy, comfortable quiet of two people who knew each other well. It was a calculated, punishing withdrawal that turned their shared home into a cold place where two strangers just occupied the same rooms. The silence was paired with something even more damaging. Debbie revealed that Phil began telling her quite openly that she was not intelligent enough for real conversation. These were not words blurted out in a moment of anger. They were delivered like flat facts assessments he seemed to truly believe. By labeling her intellectually inferior, he justified his own withdrawal. He used it as an excuse to shut her out of the kind of exchange that sustains any healthy partnership. The fracture became nearly incomprehensible during one specific family road trip. They traveled for several days to visit relatives, spending hours after hours trapped in the car. And according to Debbie, they drove the entire distance without saying a single word to one another. No talk about the scenery, no discussion about the family they were visiting, no attempt to bridge the massive distance between them. Just silence for mile after mile, a quiet testament to a marriage that had stopped functioning entirely. The final breakdown arrived when neighbors and local friends approached Debbie with hard facts about Phil's cheating. These were not vague rumors or idle suspicions. They were specific reports from people who had seen or heard about his involvement with other women. For Debbie, having her worst fears confirmed was absolutely devastating. Yet the confrontation that followed revealed something even more disturbing about the man she had married. When Debbie finally confronted Phil, he did not even try to deny the allegations. He offered no remorse and asked for zero forgiveness. Instead, he reportedly defended himself with a dismissive response that left her stunned. He told her to grow up, arguing that his behavior was just how the world worked. He insisted his cheating had nothing to do with how he felt about her. That statement offered no comfort at all. It just revealed a massive, unbridgeable disconnect between them. This was the exact moment Debbie knew the marriage was beyond saving. She had endured the silence. The condescension and neglect grew too much. She wouldn't accept an open marriage or a partner who treated fidelity like an option. She chose to leave in 1973, packed her bags, walked out of their home, headed back to Kansas City. It wasn't a loud fight or a dragged-out mess, just a quiet realization that the marriage was dead, and staying would only hurt more. The legal end took a strange turn. They skipped a standard divorce. Instead, it ended with a formal annulment-like setup finalized in 1973. This legal maneuver effectively wiped their 3-year union off the books. It treated the marriage as if it were never valid to begin with. Why they went that route, nobody knows for sure. But the result was absolute. The marriage was gone, legally undone, in a way that went beyond a normal split. The money situation was simple enough. Phil was just a student with almost nothing to his name. No big payouts, no complex alimony, and no nasty fights over who gets what. The split was clean on paper between two people who had very little to split. But the internal cost was something else entirely. For Debbie, the marriage left deep, lasting scars. For Phil, it was just a chapter he would eventually try to rewrite. Years later, when the press finally dug it up, Phil told a version that didn't match hers at all. In a 2002 Newsweek feature, he brushed it off as a peaceful, mutual choice. He claimed they never argued, that they just sat down and wondered why they had even married. The message was clear. He painted it as a youthful mistake, a quick error in judgment that ended amicably. Debbie was furious when she read that. She had stayed silent for decades to keep the peace. But watching Phil play the relationship expert while hiding his own history of control was too much. She finally decided to speak up. In a major interview, she shared her side of the story. She had kept quiet out of respect for their agreement for years, but she felt the public deserved the truth about a man who called himself an authority on love. Debbie Higgins McCall led a private life after the divorce, working as a film editor far from the cameras. She never chased the spotlight or looked for payback. She simply stood by the facts of what happened. Debbie died from cancer in 2014. She left behind a family, including the daughter who had been at the center of so much public speculation. Her voice was gone, but her account remained on the record. It stood as a direct challenge to the tidy story Dr. Phil McGraw liked to tell the world. Of course, the divorce from Debbie wasn't the end of Phil's personal journey. It was just the start of a new act that brought him to a woman who would be his partner for 50 years. Still, the questions from his first marriage kept popping up every time he gave advice on TV. Now let's talk about Phil and Robin. Phil's first marriage left a void, but it didn't stay empty for long. His sister Brenda stepped in as matchmaker. She introduced him to a woman named Robin Jo Jameson. The timing was telling. Phil was still untangling his life from Debbie when he met Robin. Robin didn't exactly have a great first impression. Phil was feeling sick and seemed pretty unfriendly, but he made up for it the next night with a date that was anything but typical. He had earned his pilot's license at 16 and took her up for a flight. For Robin, it was a turning point. She later said she felt completely safe with him, drawn to that strong, protective energy. They dated for several years before Phil proposed on Valentine's Day in 1976. They married 6 months later, August 14th, 1976. That wedding started a partnership that would eventually reach the same fame as the television show that made Phil a household name. Unlike his first marriage, this one launched with clear rules. At the core of their union sat a rigid operational agreement. Robin established early on that the word divorce was completely banned from their household. No matter how volatile an argument became, neither party was ever allowed to threaten the end of the marriage as leverage. Phil later explained the arrangement, noting they decided early on that the relationship itself was never something they were willing to risk. The very concept of divorce was off the table. It was not a word spoken, nor a possibility they ever entertained. This rule became a defining feature of their marriage and a constant point of fascination for those watching their public lives. With 2 sons, Jay and Jordan, they built a life that placed them at the center of American pop culture. Yet that public profile came at a steep price. When the Dr. Phil Show premiered in 2002 and turned into a massive success, Robin was not just some spouse in the background. She was physically and contractually present at nearly every single recording. Throughout the 21-year run of the program, she sat in the front row of the studio. Every episode ended the same way. She walked off stage hand in hand with Phil. Such constant visibility was unusual for a talk show host's spouse and invited scrutiny that only grew over time. That scrutiny took many forms, with critics and former employees frequently attacking their dynamic. They accused the couple of running a highly manufactured corporate brand rather than maintaining an organic relationship. Critics argued the McGraws packaged their marriage as a product, a symbol of stability, marketed alongside Phil's relationship advice. The set presence, the hand-holding, the curated image, all of it, to critics, served a commercial purpose instead of an authentic one. Online commenters and tabloid media went further, suggesting what some called a vigilance theory. Because Phil's first wife had raised allegations of infidelity, some observers hypothesized about Robin's true motives. They claimed her constant presence on set was not affection, but a calculated effort to watch him. The theory suggested she was keeping him under surveillance to prevent a repeat of the behavior that ended his first marriage. There was no direct evidence for this, but it persisted in the darker corners of celebrity gossip. It was fueled by the contrast between their polished image and the messy history that Debbie had previously revealed. The rumors proved that not everyone believed the story they were selling, and the struggles went beyond simple tabloid talk. The relentless speculation had persisted for over a decade, and by the summer of 2016, Phil and Robin reached their limit. That July, they filed a $250 million defamation lawsuit in a Florida state court. They targeted the publisher responsible for much of the coverage that had plagued them. The defendants included American Media Incorporated, the powerhouse behind the National Enquirer Star magazine, and the website Radar Online. This was no casual legal skirmish. It was a declaration of war against a media empire that had, according to the filing, published over 85 articles about them over 13 years. Their legal team cataloged these pieces, arguing they formed a calculated campaign of asset destruction. They claimed the publisher aimed to damage the McGraws' reputations just to boost its own flagging finances. The lawsuit's core allegations were specific and deeply damaging. Articles had claimed Phil physically confronted Robin and locked her out of their home. They also alleged Robin lived a double life to hide domestic problems. These were not minor gossip items. They were accusations of criminal behavior that, if believed, could destroy the careers of two people whose professional lives relied on credibility. Robin, in particular, had built a public identity as an advocate for victims of domestic maltreatment. She had started a foundation for people in such situations, and the tabloid allegations directly undermined that mission. Two people whose entire careers were built on their reputation as relationship experts. Robin, in particular, had crafted a public image as a fierce advocate for domestic abuse survivors. She started a non-profit foundation to support those victims, and these tabloid scandals threatened to burn it all down. Work. The lawsuit argued the publications specifically targeted the McGraws because their fame and their public stance on domestic violence made them prime targets for sensational high-traffic coverage. The legal filing also exposed what the McGraws described as a clear extortion scheme run by AMI editors. The National Enquirer had threatened to run a bombshell story about Phil's college years, claiming that back in the 1970s he had a physical fight with a man at a Texas Tech University local spot called the Copper Caboose. The story, if printed, would have branded Phil as a violent man, a reputation that would have been devastating for a guy who built his career on being a voice of reason and authority. But Phil's legal team completely tore the tabloid's threat apart. They produced historical, architectural, and city records, proving that the Copper Caboose did not even exist until 6 years after Phil had graduated and left campus. The bar wasn't even there. The alleged incident could not have happened. The tabloid had either been incredibly reckless or had deliberately fabricated the whole story. The lawsuit was filed with significant public fanfare, and both sides seemed ready for a long, ugly legal fight. The McGraws' attorney Linwood issued a statement declaring that his clients had endured years of malicious lies and had finally decided that enough was enough. American media hit back, saying they looked forward to defending themselves and proving that Phil McGraw's claims were completely baseless. But then things shifted. In August 2016, barely a month after filing the massive $250 million lawsuit court, records revealed the McGraws had abruptly filed a motion to dismiss the case with prejudice. The lawsuit was over almost as fast as it started. The dismissal came with a joint statement confirming that both parties had reached a private out-of-court financial and editorial settlement. The details of that deal remain strictly confidential, and neither side has ever revealed what was agreed upon, but the effects were obvious. The National Enquirer immediately scrubbed the stories from its archives and stopped printing divorce rumors about the pair. The campaign of defamation that had lasted over a decade ended quietly with a handshake and a sealed agreement. The sudden resolution of the case raised questions that were never really answered. Why did the McGraws file such a massive lawsuit only to drop it weeks later? What did American media offer to stop the case? And what did that confidentiality agreement hide from the public? The answers remain locked in, the terms of the settlement known only to those involved. But the battle with American media was not the only legal headache Phil McGraw would face. Other disputes followed, including a separate legal war with a former staffer named Leah Rothman, who had recorded behind-the-scenes footage and was accused of leaking secrets to the press. That case, much like the tabloid lawsuit, ended in a settlement. A clear pattern was emerging. Whenever Phil McGraw faced serious legal heat, those cases tended to be resolved quickly and behind closed doors. The public was left with questions, not answers, and the frequency of settlements suggested there was more to these stories than the official record ever revealed. Business scandals, bankruptcy, and personal life. The McGraws' legal battles have stretched far beyond tabloid defamation and into the complex world of business disputes. In 2006, a class-action lawsuit from frustrated consumers over a line of diet supplements called Shape Up reached a settlement of $10.5 million. The lawsuit had been filed in 2004 on behalf of 3 customers who claimed McGraw had made fraudulent and unscientific weight loss promises about the pills which he had heavily promoted. The plan required users to buy the product at a cost of $120 every month. The Federal Trade Commission had stepped in to investigate the brand's deceptive marketing, and the manufacturer agreed to stop selling the supplements in early 2004. While the settlement fund was backed by $6 million in vitamins and $4.5 million in cash insurance covered the costs, meaning McGraw had no personal financial obligation. He admitted no wrongdoing in the agreement. In 2009, a separate legal dispute emerged involving Robin McGraw's private business ventures. Business partners, Deborah and Brinia McGrady, filed a lawsuit against the McGraws, alleging that Robin had broken contracts and committed fraud. The plaintiffs claimed that Robin had promised to feature their skincare products on the Dr. Phil Christmas special, but the appearance never actually happened. Instead, Robin allegedly secretly chose to launch her own independent skincare line. The plaintiffs demanded $650,000 for expenses, plus $4 million for projected profits. This specific lawsuit did not make major headlines like other cases, but it reinforced a pattern of legal trouble surrounding the business ventures of the McGraws. These disputes foreshadowed the biggest professional crisis of Dr. Phil McGraw's life. In early 2024, after his 21-year daytime run ended, he launched Merit Street Media, a new cable and digital network based out of Fort Worth, Texas. The project was built on a partnership with the Trinity Broadcasting Network, a massive Christian media group, and promised a $500 million distribution deal. When it launched, the network claimed access to over 80 million homes. It featured a primetime show hosted by Dr. Phil himself, alongside programs from other famous television faces. Trouble started almost immediately. Court documents filed later showed that the financial issues at Merit Street began within months of going live. In July 2024, just 3 months in the network, cut about 40 staff members, roughly 1/3 of its entire workforce. 40 more people were let go in June 2025 during a summer break. Not even 2 years after that grand opening, Merit Street Media officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on July 2, 2025. Filings showed assets and debts hovering dangerously between $100 million and $500 million. The company identified over 200 creditors, including DirecTV, which was owed $1.7 million, and Dish Network, which was owed $900,000. They also owed $700,000 to Patesky Productions, the production house owned by Dr. Phil McGraw that supplied the network with shows. Despite these mounting failures, Phil and Robin maintained an incredibly wealthy lifestyle. They split their time between a massive, highly secure estate in Beverly Hills, California, and a second luxury home in Texas. If you enjoyed this deep dive, check out the next video on your screen and subscribe to the channel for more updates.